I was lucky enough to be here last week to hear Father Bob talk about human rights, and I feel that I've been given an impossible act to follow. Last week, of course, you heard the former Procurator General of the Dominican Order, a renowned expert on canon law. This week, you've got someone who's neither a theologian nor an academic feminist. In fact, I'm the person who licenses kebab vans in Oxford at the moment, so if you want to leave, I'll pause while you do. Now, when Father John asked me to talk about feminism as a Catholic, my first reaction was, well, I'm not sure I'm actually the right person. Am I a feminist? And probably, I think like a lot of women of my generation, I'm guilty of taking for granted a lot of the gains that have been made by earlier generations. Equal access to education, maternity pay, maternity leave, equality at work were more or less established by the time I went to university. I wasn't sure, actually, whether there was that much left to fight for. But as I thought about it, I discovered a real sense of discomfort and unease in myself when I asked the question. And I think a lot of it actually has to do with the fact that I'm a Catholic. I support the Church's teachings on abortion, contraception, divorce and family life. And I know from experience that raising an alternative perspective in women's group provokes a huge amount of furious response. So I've always felt left on the margins. This evening, I want to look at the way in which feminist thought has developed in secular society, and then also go on to look at why the Church has developed its own understanding of women. I want to see how well Catholicism actually stands up to the accusations that are often levelled against it by society. And then finally, I want to see how much we can actually make common cause with feminism. So the first wave of feminism really focused on women's education, property rights, suffrage. It started in the 19th century, spread across Europe, the United States, and a lot in the Middle East, actually, so it's very much a cross-cultural thing. And by the mid-20th century, most of those aims had been met, but with quite a mixed response, actually, from the Catholic Church. In response to the women's suffrage campaign in the US, the first Catholic Bishop of Denver, in an 1877 lecture, fretted about battalions of old maids disappointed in love and claimed that there never was a woman happy in her home who wished for female suffrage. And he also asked, who will take charge of these young children, if they consent to have any, while mothers as surgeons are operating indiscriminately upon the victims of a terrible rail disaster? So, opposition to the first wave of feminism was based very much on the belief that a woman's place was in the home, looking after her children and supporting her husband. Any distraction provided by public life or work was considered a bad thing. But luckily, things were a bit more enlightened in England, and Cardinal Vaughan actually supported women's suffrage, and a Catholic movement for suffrage was set up in 1912. Of course, the feminism which probably our generation most thinks of is the women's rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. And like the human rights movement, it focuses very much on the importance of the individual and on personal autonomy. It's championed contraception, abortion, which freed women from their role as mothers. The American radical feminist Shulamith Firestone, writing in 1970, compares feminism with Marxism and talks of freeing women from the means of reproduction. Women were to be freed from their biological destiny. They were engaged in a battle with men and were to compete with them for power and influence. The radical feminists in the 60s and 70s were pretty dismissive of the differences between men and women and really sought to underplay that. It's really interesting, actually, to reread Firestone now. The utopian society which she imagined was an impossibility when she was writing. Now, with the development of new reproductive techniques such as IVF and donor eggs, that actually has become a reality. More recent secular feminism has aimed to deal with what it sees as the failings of second wave feminism, and is very critical of the fact that the 60s and 70s were driven by white middle-class women and their agenda. So I think, to summarise then, Secular feminism very much emphasises the individual and her rights, with a woman's right to choose becoming an absolute. As with the debate we had last week over human rights, there's a devotion to the cult of autonomy. So it's my money becomes it's my body. It tends to place little value on women's roles as wives and mothers. Instead, it emphasises the role of women in the world, competing alongside men for economic power and influence. I think that you also find this very little sense of women as relational beings or of responsibilities going hand in hand with rights. I think also there's a loss of the sense of service and sacrifice and a preoccupation with having the goods of this world. And I think it's against these criteria that secular society judges the Catholic Church. It sees a church which it thinks is ruled entirely by men, from the parish priest right up to the Pope. What makes matters even worse is it is these men who try to limit women's freedom by forbidding artificial contraception, abortion, divorce. So that's the charge that is made against the church. But are we really as bad as we're seen to be? Let's have a look at the development then of the church's position on women. And I think that Pope John Paul II's 1988 encyclical, Mulieris Dignitatem, is actually a very useful starting point. Here, John Paul II goes back and looks at Jesus' own treatment of women. And in the Gospel, he's seen treating women with love and respect and giving them back their dignity. He uses women in parables to explain the kingdom of heaven. So you've got the example of the cook and the yeast. He even engages in religious debate with women, with a Samaritan woman at the well and with Martha on the death of Lazarus. And it is women, of course, who are at the foot of the cross and are the first to bring the good news of the resurrection. John Paul II also reminds us that when Jesus talks about the permanence of marriage, he's very much going against the culture of the time, because divorce prevailed in both Jewish and Roman custom, and it was divorce which actually was particularly damaging to women at the time. Later on, he goes on to affirm that men and women are created as equals for a mutual relationship of self-giving, that the male domination of women as a consequence of the fall and harms men as much as it harms women. Mary represents a humanity which belongs to all human beings, both men and women. And Christ's attitude towards women confirms the truth about the equality of men and women, but it doesn't deny their differences. And in Mulieris Dignitatem, it also seems quite clear that Pope John Paul II wanted to do away with the idea that women are subject to their husbands. And he says, the awareness that in marriage there is mutual subjection of the spouses out of reverence for Christ, and not just in the wife to the husband, must gradually establish itself in hearts, consciences, behaviour and customs. So from the earliest days of the Christian Church, we have a belief that women are of equal spiritual and moral worth as men. And our whole culture as Catholics is peopled with strong, intelligent and independent women who shaped the Church. Medieval abbesses such as Hilda of Whitby in the 7th century and St Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th were superb administrators and wielded huge amounts of power and influence. St Catherine of Siena worked to bring the papacy back to Rome from Avignon and acted as a diplomat, brokering peace between Florence and the Papal States. And if legend is to be believed, even our own patron saint here in Oxford of St Fride's dismissed a handsome prince on horseback so that she could found a nunnery and devote herself to caring for the poor and sick. But from early times, women were also valued, not just as administrators in the church, but for their intellectual abilities. It was Pope Benedict XIV who appointed Maria Agnesi, an 18th century mathematician, to the chair of mathematics, philosophy and physics at the University of Bologna, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe. And in fact, it took Oxford University another 200 years to catch up with that and appoint its first female professor. In more recent times, St Edith Stein, the philosopher, Carmelite nun who was martyred at Auschwitz, has said that women should all pursue their independent calling, whether it be in the church, marriage, or in a worldly profession. And in the church today, women are visible at all levels, often driving the church's mission in fields of education and health. Pope Francis has said on a number of occasions he'd like to see more women at senior levels in the church. And we already do have women, such as Mary Ann Glendon, working in pontifical bodies, such as the Council for Justice and Peace. So I think that we can show that the accusation that women are marginalised in the church is not one that stands up to scrutiny. Women have been valued as equals and have played an active role from the earliest times. We are left, though, with two outstanding charges: the refusal to ordain women as priests and the Church's prohibition on artificial contraception and on abortion. The Church's position on an all-male priesthood, I think, isn't a reflection at all on the abilities or values of women. As I've tried to show, women have always been a vital part of the Church at all levels. No, the reason for the all-male priesthood is based on the belief that the priest is acting in persona Christi, representing Christ in all his humanity, and Christ was a man. For outsiders looking in, I think there is very much a readiness here to see the priesthood as a job, part of a career path, just as you might find in HSBC or in General Motors. But we know that the priesthood isn't simply a job. It's a calling to a certain way of life. It's more about service than about power or influence. And that calling to a life of holiness applies to all Christian men and women. Being a priest doesn't necessarily make you a better Christian. And the danger of applying the secular outlook here is that it might lead to clericalism and devalues the other form of witness and mission in the church, which are every bit as necessary and as important as the priesthood. The Church's 1983 Code of Canon Law describes marriage as a partnership for the whole of life, and it has two equal purposes: the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. It is the separation of these two purposes which has led to the Church's continued opposition to artificial contraception. And let's be honest, the Church's teaching is, as Hamlet says, more honoured in the breach than in the observance. New natural family planning techniques have developed since Humanae Vitae was written, but sadly, in many parts of the Catholic Church, they simply haven't been promoted or explained. There's a sense that that's a battle that's lost and we can't change things. There's widespread ignorance and scepticism about how natural family planning works. Couples already fear that avoiding contraception will inevitably lead to lots of children. And we live in a society where it's financially very difficult to support a large family. Unless I think there's greater pastoral support for couples, then personally I think it's probably too late to change many minds on this issue. On the issue of abortion, I think it's too easy to see the Church's stance as anti-women. But that's not really where I believe the Church starts from. In opposing abortion, it's not seeking to make women victims of their own fertility. Rather, it is looking at the wider good of protecting the most vulnerable in society, the unborn child. So to summarise the Church's position then, I think we can say the Church sees women as equal to men, but different. Instead of being engaged with a battle with men, we complement each other. We're a gift one to the other. Women are not seen as isolated individuals, but are in relationship to others. The Church values the talents of women as much as it values those of men, and we should use those talents actively in society, not only for our own gain, but for the service of others. Where we differ most, I think, from the secular feminists is that we cannot be seen as separated from our role as wives and mothers. The Church sees marriage and motherhood as privileges and not as instruments of oppression, because it emphasises men's duties as well as their rights. What I'd like to do now is to take a look at the progress that has been claimed for women by the feminist movement and show that some of those achievements have been exaggerated and others have, I believe, caused new problems for women and particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable. As I said earlier, many of the original aims of the women's movement have been achieved: access to education, property rights, equality in the workplace, but up to a point. In some areas, the achievements have been quite patchy and slow. It's now 45 years since the Equal Pay Act was passed, and still women earn only 85% of what men earn in the UK. Interestingly, they do seem to have equal pay with men in their 20s, and then in their 30s, when they tend to be having children, having time off for maternity leave, that's when they fall behind and they never get back up to that level. So it seems that within secular society, it's women having children and taking time off to care for them is seen as a problem, and it's not one that we seem to have addressed properly. In the UK, of course, women are still stubbornly underrepresented in most senior positions, and working women in the UK spend 3 times as long on domestic chores each week as men do. So there's clearly quite a lot of scope for improvement in terms of the way women are treated in society at large. But what I personally find worrying is the fact that the feminist movement has not succeeded in changing the view of many men about the dignity and worth of women. A recent survey by the National Union of Students found that over 2/3 of female university students had been subject to sexual harassment, and nearly a quarter had experienced unwanted sexual advances. Closer to home, Oxford University now runs sexual consent workshops. And quite frankly, I think we should be appalled that some of our brightest and best don't really understand or respect sexual boundaries. The advent of contraception separated sex from procreation, but I think sometimes you can see that it has made recreational sex all too easy, and women can be seen as objects of desire rather than long-term loving partners. I don't know if any of you ever saw the 2011 Christmas advert from the British Pregnancy Advice Service. It was inviting women to order the morning after pill online in preparation for Christmas parties. So it had the word sex picked out in festive lights. Over it was the caption, "Getting turned on this Christmas?" I don't think you actually need to be a prude to be quite sickened by the way that such casual encouragement of sex can impoverish the emotional lives of both men and women. I think the current debate about gender-based abortion shows, I think, some of the tensions within feminism. On the one hand, there is a perfect logic to the argument that a woman has an absolute right to choose to end her pregnancy and to assert her bodily autonomy. And if she's allowed to do that, then she should be allowed to do so for whatever reason she has. Yet, in supporting abortion on gender grounds, feminists are finding themselves in an alliance with those who see women as second-class citizens and having baby girls as a disaster. As a city councillor in Oxford, I'd say some of my most difficult cases are housing ones. I expect most of you know that Oxford has a desperate housing shortage. It's had for a number of years and it's taking a long time to improve. Last week it was named the least affordable place to live in the UK. So, like most councillors, I'm called fairly regularly by people in crisis, in desperate need of a home. In the vast majority of cases, these are single mothers. Often, they're in work. But the demands of having children and holding down a job means that it's near impossible for them to earn enough money on their own to afford the rent in a place like Oxford. But what has saddened me the most is that their former partners are no longer on the scene. They seem to have no concern at all to help them to find accommodation or to contribute towards their children. The very worst was a woman who was faced with moving house and moving boxes and furniture only weeks after having a caesarean. And I said, "Well, is your partner around?" And she just shrugged and said, "No, he's not here anymore. He's not here to help." So the sexual revolution was supposed to bring women greater freedom, and perhaps it actually has for some affluent women. Yet I think for many of the poorest women in society, it has left them isolated and not independent, and actually in greater need than previous generations. If I reflect on my own experience, I think I can say that the only time that I've come up against barriers is when I became a mother. I couldn't reconcile the long working hours in management consultancy with having small children. But the barriers that came up again, of course, were in secular society. They weren't a problem in terms of the church. And it was then that I became a city councillor, as it enabled me to use my experience in public life, as well as being there for my children. And I think it's very sad, with living costs these days, that this isn't actually feasible for many women. The solution from all political parties seems to be to offer more childcare. The danger of this is that it simply condemns many women to a treadmill of low pay and long hours, when actually what they would rather have is a better paid job and a bit more time with their children. It grieves me to say this, but the Labour Party, my own political party at the moment, is a pretty bleak place to be for a Catholic who upholds the Church's teachings on abortion and marriage. There have been a number of attempts in recent years to whip parliamentary votes on issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage. Previously, there'd always been a free vote, which allowed MPs to vote with their conscience. And I know of one Catholic Labour MP who was faced with deselection and cold-shouldered by a lot of long-term colleagues for voting with his conscience. Ironically, it's actually harder, I think, for being a Catholic woman than a Catholic man in the Labour Party. And for some reason, the Labour Party is more tolerant of men who uphold church teaching. There's a group called Emily's List, which is there to get more women into Parliament, which seems great, excellent, but you have to be pro-choice to get any support from them. Finally, I want to see how far we can make common cause with feminism. I think that most modern Catholic women do want to be able to reconcile themselves with feminism. And it would, of course, be wrong to repudiate all the gains that have been made in terms of women's work and education, something that, in fact, the Church itself has been prominent in promoting. I think we ought to work with feminists to further these causes and to fight against anything that threatens women's dignity, such as pornography, trafficking, and sexual violence. And while we can't always agree with them on things like abortion, we can certainly work with them to build a world where women with unplanned pregnancies are supported and where abortion becomes the very last and the worst option. I think the Catholic Church probably needs to place more emphasis on women's role in society. Centuries ago, motherhood would have taken up most of a woman's adult life. In societies today, it will only take up a fraction, and so we need to encourage greater use of women's talents outside the home. Conversely, secular feminism, I think, needs to learn to value women's role as mothers, as relational people, different but equal to men. So I think I'm back where I started, a reluctant and faint-hearted feminist. Thank you.